How's it going, everyone? Austin Honecker here. I just wanted to come on here for a while and give him a review for All Elite Wrestling's AEW Dark Elevation from tonight, which is September 27th, 2021. I gotta say, it was awesome from start to finish. For the matches, match one, it was Thunder Rosa versus Kayla Sparks. That was a great match, but the ending to it, Thunder Rosa went over with the Fire Thunder driver. Match two, it was the Dark Order, which are John Silver, Alex Reynolds, 5 and 10, versus Eric James, TJ Crawford, Kevin Tibbs, and Dean Alexander. That was a great match, but the ending to it, the Dark Order went over because 10 made Eric James pass out to the full Nelson. And match three, which was the main event, it was Paul White versus VSK, RSP, and CPA in a 3-on-1 handicap match. That was a squash match, but the ending to it, Paul White went over because Paul White pinned VSK and CPA with a double choke slam. Now, besides the matches, AEW done exclusive interviews with the talent after last week's Grand Slam episodes of All Elite Wrestling's AEW Dynamite Grand Slam and All Elite Wrestling's AEW Rampage Grand Slam. And Britt Baker, Rebel, and Jamie Hayter were the first ones to be interviewed, and Britt Baker was talking about how she kicked Ruby Soho's ass and everything, and retained the AEW Women's title and everything. And Britt Baker also gloated on about how she was the first ever women's main event match on the Lights Out match with Thunder Rosa. How she main evented both AEW Dynamite and AEW Rampage and defended the AEW Women's title on both shows, being the first woman to do so and everything. And Britt Baker also talked about how DMD was the three words that were going to stay, and she was going to stay women's champion, and nobody was going to take it from her and everything. That was cool. MJF was the second one to be interviewed, and MJF was talking about how nobody's been able to beat him. MJF was talking about how he beat Brian Pillman Jr. without breaking a sweat, and talked about how nobody's been able to beat him clean and everything. And MJF also talked about how Queens, New York was a dump, and they'll be in Long Island, New York soon in front of his actual hometown and everything. And MJF also talked about how he's wanting new challenges and to beat everybody's ass and everything because he's better than you and you know it and everything. Brian Danielson was the third one to be interviewed, and Brian Danielson was talking about how it felt great to be wrestling after 5 months and everything, and talked about how he was glad that Kenny Omega was his first match, and even though he didn't win, it was still a great match and everything. And Brian Danielson also talked about how Kenny Omega didn't want a rematch against him and everything. And Brian Danielson also talked about how there was a bunch of guys in AEW he wants to kick their fucking heads in and everything. And Brian Danielson talked about how he wanted to eventually be the AEW champion and everything. That was cool. Men of the Year, which are Scorpio Sky and Ethan Page, were the fourth ones to be interviewed. And Ethan Page was talking about how he looked up to Chris Jericho when he was a kid, and how Chris Jericho was a Canadian legend and everything. And Ethan Page talked about how he embarrassed Chris Jericho on Rampage and everything. And then Scorpio Sky talked about how him and Ethan Page have been overlooked and everything. And Scorpio Sky also talked about how him and Ethan Page weren't going to let anybody steal their spotlight and everything anymore and everything. And then Scorpio Sky got all pissed off and Ethan Page got all pissed off and everything as well. And they continued to talk more shit and everything, which that was cool. And the Bryan Danielson interview was cool, by the way, too. Eddie Kingston and Homicide were the fifth ones to be interviewed, and Eddie Kingston talked about how it was great to be back in New York and everything, and Homicide talked about how it was great to be in New York and everything as well, which that was cool. Brian Pillman Jr. Eddie Kingston and Homicide were the fifth ones to be interviewed. By the way, Brian Pillman Jr. was the sixth one to be interviewed, and Brian Pillman Jr. was talking about how the Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York City had over 20-some thousand people in attendance and everything, and Brian Pillman Jr. talked about how AEW was the best company, the best wrestling promotion ever, and how AEW is a family, and whether we win or we lose, we were going to do our best and everything. And Brian Pillman Jr. also talked about how he was going to go in the ring and out of the ring and everything and do the best he can and everything as well. That was cool. Brian Pillman Jr. was the sixth one to be interviewed. By the way, Ortiz was the seventh one to be interviewed, and Ortiz was talking about how it was great to be in New York and how he grew up in a bad home life, wrestling broke and only having $2 to get a bag of chips and some drink or whatever, and then now that he came to AEW, he's finally got a home and everything, and talked about how AEW was the best wrestling promotion to work for and everything as well. That was cool. Anthony Bowens was the eighth one to be interviewed, and Anthony Bowens was talking about how it was amazing to be in New York and everything, and talked about how there was 20-some thousand people in attendance and everything, and it felt amazing being in New York and everything as well, which that was cool. Max Caster was the ninth one to be interviewed, and Max Caster was pretty much going over his rap on Tony Khan and everything, which that was cool. The Acclaimed, which are Max Caster and Anthony Bowens, came out, and Max Caster done a rap on Tony Khan, which that was cool, and Anthony Bowens said, New York, the Acclaimed have arrived and everything, and then Anthony Bowens was talking about how Anthony Bowens was also talking about how Tony Khan was a chicken shit and called him out and everything, and then Tony Khan came out, and Tony Khan was saying, I've written a lot of wrestling cards in my life, but never in my life have I ever done a rap, and I'm not going to start now. So, to help me with this rap is Lil Larizavit. So Lil Larizavit came out, and Tony Khan done his rap on The Acclaimed and said, I'm Tony Khan, the CEO. The Acclaimed, I will suspend the Acclaimed for 30 more days, and now let me introduce to you the Varsity Blondes. So the Varsity Blondes, which are Brian Pillman Jr. and Griff Garrison, came out, and the Varsity Blondes and the Varsity Blondes and the Acclaimed started brawling and everything, and the Varsity Blondes kicked the Acclaimed's ass and everything, and then the Varsity Blondes stood tall while Tony Khan went backstage. Well, Tony Khan and Lil Larizavit stood on the stage and everything, and then the Varsity Blondes embraced a moment with Tony Khan, and Lil Larizavit left, and Tony Khan did too, and then the Varsity Blondes celebrated while the Acclaimed were laid out and everything. That was cool. And Paul White was the 10th one to be interviewed, And Paul White was talking about how it was great to be in New York and how the stadium filled over 20 some thousand people and how it felt great to be in the ring again, and talked about how AEW was the best wrestling promotion to work for and everything, and was saying that he hoped that AEW comes to the Arthur Ashe Stadium a lot and everything as well. That was cool. Now, besides all that, Tony Schiavone, Mark Henry, and Eddie Kingston done commentary throughout the whole show. They done awesome as usual. And the referees for the event were Mike Posey, Rick Knox, and Aubrey Edwards. Rick Knox refereed the match between Thunder Rosa versus Kayla Sparks. That was Rick Knox, by the way. Mike Posey refereed the match between the Dark Order versus Eric James, TJ Crawford, Kevin Tibbs, and Dean Alexander. And that was Mike Posey, by the way. And Aubrey Edwards refereed the match between Paul White versus RSP, VSK, and CPA. All the referees done awesome as usual. Now anyway, I just wanted to come on here for a while and give them a review for All Elite Wrestling's AEW Dark Elevation from tonight, which is September 27th, 2021. Like I said, it was awesome from start to finish. And with that being said, my name is Austin Honecker, and I will catch your ass down the road. Peace out.